Hi, everyone, and welcome to my podcast, That's Life, I Swear. I'm your host, Rick Barron. In the summer of 1914, the most powerful nations on Earth stumbled into the most destructive war the world had ever seen, World War I. Not because they wanted catastrophe, not because they had run out of alternatives, but because of their plans, their pride, and their failure to truly listen to one another made catastrophe all but inescapable. In this book review, I'll be diving deep into one of the most consequential books of the 20th century, a book that won the Pulitzer Prize, lived on the desk of a president during the most dangerous nuclear standoff in human history, and still reads today with the dynamic force of a great thriller. But most of all, this book tells a story about how the same mistakes keep happening and what it costs when no one is reading history carefully enough to stop them. Ready to begin? Let's turn the page. Welcome to That's Life, I Swear. This podcast is about life's happenings in this world that conjure up such words as intriguing, frightening, life-changing, inspiring, and more. I'm Rick Barron, your host. That said, here's the rest of this story. So let's get into the abstract of this book. Now, there are books that illuminate history, and then there are books that intervene in it. Barbara Tuchman's book, The Guns of August, belongs to the second category. Published in 1962 and awarded the Pulitzer Prize the following year, it remains, more than 6 decades later, the definitive popular account of the 31 days in the summer of 1914 that detonated the modern world. Tuchman's subject is the opening month of the First World War, from the mobilization orders and secret military timetables of the major European powers to the failure of Germany's Schlieffen Plan and the grinding stalemate at the Battle of Marne that condemned an entire generation to 4 years of industrial slaughter in the trenches. But to describe it merely as military history would be to undersell it. The Guns of August is a masterwork of narrative history, an inquiry into the mechanisms of human folly that reads less like a chronicle and more like an unfolding tragedy, one in which the audience, unlike the characters on stage, knows with terrible clarity how it ends. Now, Tuchman opens the book with one of the most celebrated paragraphs in American letters, the funeral procession of King Edward VII in May of 1910, when 9 monarchs rode together through London streets in a last gorgeous pageant of the old order. I mean, it is a scene of dazzling brilliance poised at the edge of an abyss. From there, Tuchman traces the web of alliances, mobilization plans, military vanities, diplomatic miscalculations, and sheer institutional rigidity that dragged Europe's great powers into a war none of them had fully intended and none of them could stop. Now, Germany's plan demanded for the invasion of neutral Belgium, France's suicidal cult of the offensive, Britain's agonized entry into the conflict, and Russia's lumbering advance into East Prussia. Each thread is examined with forensic precision. The result is a book that archives something almost paradoxical. It makes the reader forget that they already know the outcome. Now let's talk about the author. Barbara Tuchman was born on January 30th, 1912, into the kind of family for whom history was not an academic abstraction, but a living inheritance. Her grandfather, Henry Morgenthau Sr., served as Woodrow Wilson's ambassador to the Ottoman Empire during the First World War, a posting that placed him at the center of some of the most serious conflicts and very consequential and tragic events. Her uncle, Henry Morgan Jr., served as Franklin Roosevelt's Secretary of the Treasury. Raised in privilege on New York's Upper East Side, educated at Radcliffe, Tuchman entered a world that expected women to observe history from the sidelines. Not for her. She chose instead to write it. Now, what makes Tuchman's achievement so extraordinary is that she accomplished it entirely outside the academy. I mean, she had no doctorate degree, she had no professorship. Her career began modestly with journalism and research in New York and Tokyo. She worked as an editorial assistant at The Nation magazine and as an American correspondent in London. experiences that sharpened her instinct for the telling detail and the clarifying antidote. Her earlier books attracted attention, but it was The Guns of August, her fourth work, that made her a household name. Now, her book spent 42 consecutive weeks on the New York Times bestseller list. Think about that. Was selected by the Modern Library as one of the most 100 greatest nonfiction books in the English language, and earned the 1963 Pulitzer Prize for General Nonfiction. She won a second Pulitzer in 1972 for Stilwell and the American's Experience in China. Her subsequent works, The Proud Tower, A Distant Mirror, and The March of Folly, confirmed her as the preeminent narrative historian of the 20th century. She died in 1989, having demonstrated with rare and immeasurable force that history written for everyone is not lesser history. It may, in fact, be the most important kind. So what drew my interest in reading this book? I came to The Guns of August through an unlikely door, you might say. A remark made by President John F. Kennedy during the Cuban Missile Crisis, at the height of the most dangerous nuclear standoff the world has ever survived. Kennedy reportedly turned to his brother Robert and said, "I am not going to follow a course which will allow anyone to write a comparable book about this time and call it The Missiles of October." He distributed copies of Tuchman's book to his national security team and to British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan. He ordered it sent to military bases around the world. This was, I thought, an astonishing testimony. A sitting president using a history book published mere months earlier as a real-time guide to avoiding the apocalypse. The idea that a single work of narrative history could span decades and genuinely alter the calculations of the most powerful man on earth seemed to me the most persuasive argument imaginable for why history matters. What I encountered far exceeded the expectation that recommendation had created. The opening paragraph alone, Tuchman's description of King Edward VII's funeral, 9 kings riding 3 abreast through London in a dying blaze of imperial splendor, just stopped me cold. It took her 8 hours to write, and yet reads like it arrived fully formed from some higher register of English prose. From there, I was not so much reading as being pulled toward the narrative momentum, operating less like the familiar drip of textbook reading and more like the gathering force of a great novel. I found myself genuinely uncertain, despite knowing the history, whether the catastrophe could be averted. Now, what drew me to this book was the promise of a lesson that history rarely delivers clearly. That events which seem, in retrospect, to have been inevitable were in fact the product of specific, identifiable, and unavoidable human failures. Now, what can we learn from this book? What's the takeaway? The central argument of The Guns of August is both simple and terrifying. The First World War was not inevitable. You see, it was the product of hubris, rigidity, miscalculation, and the tragic momentum of institutional plans that had taken on a life of their own. Plans so detailed, so deeply embedded in the machinery of state, that the human beings in charge of them found themselves unable to stop the machine once it began to move. Tuchman shows with patience and damning precision how the Schlieffen Plan, Germany's elaborate strategy for a two-front war, unfolded. 1. Transformed from a military option into a straitjacket. 2. How France's doctrine of the offensive led its generals to send men marching into artillery fire in bright red trousers. You're just asking for it there. And 3. How the alliance system converted a regional crisis into a continental catastrophe with the grim efficiency of a conveyor belt. The lesson is not merely historical, it is structural. Organizations, nations, and institutions can develop such momentum in a particular direction that even their official leaders cannot reverse them. The deeper takeaway, and the one that resonated so profoundly with Kennedy in October of 1962, is about the danger of miscalculation, the gap between what decision makers believe they are doing and what they are actually setting into motion. The German chancellor who, when asked after the war how it all happened, he replied, if only one knew. That exchange, relayed by Tuchman, haunted President Kennedy at the edge of nuclear catastrophe. He was determined not to be that chancellor. The book teaches us that communication failures in diplomacy as in war have body counts. And it teaches perhaps most urgently that the willingness to pause, to seek alternatives, to exhaust every diplomatic option before accepting the logic of escalation is not weakness. It is the most sophisticated and demanding form of strength. You see, in an age of renewed great power tension, this is not a lesson of the past. It is a warning for the present. Well, there you go, my friends. That's life, I swear. For further information regarding the material covered in this episode, I invite you to visit my website, which can be found on Apple Podcasts for show notes and the episode transcript. As always, I thank you for the privilege of you listening and your interest. Be sure to subscribe here or wherever you listen to podcasts so you don't miss an episode. And we'll see you soon.